You're standing on a ridge in northern Europe. The sun hasn't climbed above the horizon, not because it's dawn, but because it's November and the sun barely climbs at all anymore. Your breath crystallizes the moment it leaves your lungs. The wind cuts across the exposed skin of your arms, and within minutes, your fingers lose their color. You haven't evolved for this. Your ancestors lived in Africa, where the air itself wrapped around you like a blanket. But you're not in Africa. Something necessity, curiosity, desperation, take your pick, drove your kind northward. And now you're shivering uncontrollably, watching the other humans around you do the same. Someone pulls an animal's skin tighter around their body. It's not elegant. It's not fashionable. It's just effective. And in that moment, wrapped in dead animal, you realize something profound. Survival sometimes looks like wearing what was once alive. This is the story of how humans learned to wear clothes. And it's not the simple story you might think. It's not about fashion or self-expression, or the human need to look good at gatherings. It's about the moment we recognized that our bodies, which had been shaped by millions of years of evolution for a specific climate, were now inadequate for the world we decided to conquer. Clothing is the ultimate hack. It's us admitting that nature didn't finish the job, and we'd need to jury-rig our own solution. The question seems obvious when you ask it. Why did humans start wearing clothes? The standard answer taught in schools is temperature regulation. Humans got cold. Animals got warm. So we took their pelts and wrapped ourselves. Case closed. But this explanation collapses under the slightest pressure. Because humans didn't invent clothing only in cold climates. We find evidence of clothing in warm regions thousands of years before we needed it for insulation. And clothing, when it finally emerged in the archaeological record, appears to have been about far more than just staying warm. It was about identity, status, ritual, and something even deeper, a fundamental restructuring of how we thought about ourselves and our bodies. Let's start with the timeline, because the fossil record is actually more honest than we'd like it to be. For roughly 200,000 years, anatomically, modern humans existed without clothing. Think about that number. 200,000 years. Our bodies were identical to yours, same skeletal structure, same skin, same capacity to freeze to death. Yet for most of our existence as a species, we simply didn't wear clothes in any consistent, complex way. What changed? The evidence points to around 100,000 years ago, possibly earlier, when humans began engaging in sophisticated hunting of large marine mammals. At this point, in places like South Africa and Australia, you see the emergence of bone and stone tools specifically designed to work with hides and furs. Not crude scraping, actual specialized equipment. The sophistication suggests this wasn't accidental. Someone figured out that animal skin could be processed, softened, shaped, and then affixed to the human body. But here's what's interesting. These first attempts at clothing weren't actually necessary for survival in most of these locations. South Africa was warm. Australia was warm. So why bother? This is where the psychology enters. Humans had developed something new, the capacity to use objects as symbols. A bone tool wasn't just a practical item, it was a display of skill, intelligence, and status. Someone who could craft a sophisticated bone point was advertising something about themselves to their community. Clothing tapped into this same psychological infrastructure. When you wrap yourself in the pelt of an animal you've hunted, you're not just insulating your body. You're making a statement. You're saying, I am capable. I am dangerous. I understand the world well enough to take from it. This is cognitive armor, not thermal armor. The real explosion of clothing, the moment when it became truly ubiquitous, happens around 50,000 years ago, in conjunction with what archaeologists call the Upper Paleolithic transition. This is when human culture goes into overdrive. Suddenly you see cave paintings, complex symbolism, abstract thinking captured in material form, and you see sophisticated clothing in cold climates, particularly in Europe and Central Asia. The Gravettian culture, which existed roughly 30,000 years ago, produced some of the earliest clear evidence of tailored garments. These weren't just hides thrown over shoulders. These were intentionally cut, fitted clothing designed to move with the body. What happened between those warm-weather humans 100,000 years ago, draping themselves in symbolic pelts, and the Gravettian people's engineering sophisticated fit? Population pressure, human migration, and most crucially, cognitive shift that made all of this possible. By 50,000 years ago, humans had developed the capacity for what anthropologists call theory of mind, the ability to imagine what other people are thinking. This sounds abstract, but its practical implications are enormous. You can imagine someone else's cold. You can imagine what they're thinking when they see you dressed a certain way. You can plan clothing that signals what you want others to understand about you. You can look at a raw animal hide and imagine it cut in a specific pattern, fitted to a specific body, worn in a specific context for a specific reason. This capacity transformed clothing from practical covering into language. And like all language, it immediately became subject to the rules of status and hierarchy. By the time we see clear evidence of complex tailored clothing, bone needles, eyed needles specifically designed for sewing, coordinated outfits made from multiple animal sources, we're seeing humans using clothing as they still use it today, to communicate something about themselves, their wealth, their skill, their belonging. Consider what a tailored garment requires. You need to understand the concept of a pattern. You need to be able to plan before you execute. You need to have developed the hand-eye coordination and fine motor control through evolutionary selection or through learned skill. You need access to materials. And critically, you need an audience. Why spend weeks creating a fitted garment unless there's someone to see it? Clothing, in its sophisticated form, is inherently social. It's a medium of communication with other humans. The archaeological evidence from burial sites reveals something darker. In graves from 30,000 to 20,000 years ago, you find people interred with extraordinary amounts of clothing, multiple layers, careful arrangement, sometimes decorations like mammoth ivory sewn into the seams. These individuals were being buried as if their presentation mattered even in death. These weren't practical burials of people who happened to own clothes. These were ritual statements about status, achieved through the medium of elaborate clothing. Someone had decided that this person, dead or alive, deserved to be seen as special. This connects to something fundamental about human consciousness. We are the only animal that worries about how we look to each other. A dog doesn't know whether it's wearing a quality collar. A wolf certainly doesn't care that it's wearing a status-indicating fur pattern. But humans will trade enormous practical advantages for the opportunity to signal status through adornment. We'll suffer discomfort for fashion. We'll invest resources in clothing that serves no practical function whatsoever. The Paleolithic people understood this instinctively. By 20,000 years ago, you see evidence of clothing that's deliberately decorative furs, arranged to show off the quality of the hunting or the craftsmanship of the processing. You see evidence of dyeing fabrics and hides different colors, of sewn-in decorative bones and teeth. None of this improves thermal insulation. All of it communicates status, skill, and aesthetic judgment. Now, there's a counterargument worth considering. Not all anthropologists agree on the timeline or the primacy of these interpretations. Some researchers point out that the evidence for clothing before 30,000 years ago is fragmentary at best. Fabric doesn't preserve well. Hides decompose. Most of what we see is indirect evidence. Specialized tools that we infer were used for leather working, but that could have had other purposes. The bone needles could have been used for something entirely different. We're reading social significance into artifacts that might have been purely practical. Furthermore, there's the reality that in many warm climate cultures, sophisticated societies developed without complex clothing traditions. The peoples of the South Pacific, the Aboriginal Australians, the indigenous peoples of equatorial Africa, many of these groups developed extraordinary material cultures, sophisticated social structures, and complex systems of meaning, without anything resembling the heavily tailored clothing systems of colder climates. Perhaps we are projecting technological progression narrative onto the evidence, assuming that cold climate complexity represents progress, when really it represents adaptation to specific environmental challenges. There's also something worth acknowledging about the gap between possibility and probability. Yes, tailored clothing would have been advantageous in Ice Age Europe. But humans are deeply conservative creatures. We tend to stick with what works. The fact that it took tens of thousands of years for clothing to evolve from simple wrapping to tailored garments suggests that maybe these advantages weren't as obvious as they seem to us now. Maybe the people wearing simple hides weren't suffering from inadequate clothing. They were doing fine with what they had. But if we zoom out and look at what clothing actually is, across all of human history and all of human cultures, we see something consistent. Clothing is always about communication. It's about saying something to the world and to yourself about what you are. The earliest tailored clothing represents the moment when humans decided that how they appeared to others mattered enough to invest serious time and skill. And that moment coincides exactly with the explosion of symbolic thinking. With art, with ritual, with the emergence of everything we recognize as complex human culture. You could say clothing didn't cause this shift. You could say the shift in consciousness caused clothing. But that distinction might miss the point. Clothing and symbolic thinking are the same thing happening at different levels. When a human realizes that an animal skin can be transformed into something that both protects and communicates, that's the birth of symbolic thought. The skin becomes not just a thing, but a medium. And the body becomes not just a biological fact, but a canvas for meaning. Think about what this means for how we see ourselves. Before clothing, the human body was just what you were born with. After clothing, the human body became something that could be curated, arranged, presented. You could be cold, so you put on a heavier skinches. You could be wealthy, so you wore furs that took weeks to process. You could be a warrior, so you adorned your clothing with trophies. The body, beneath the clothes, became something almost irrelevant. What mattered was the presentation. What mattered was the story you were telling about yourself. This is the philosophical implication that separates humans from every other animal on Earth. We have the capacity to be something other than what we are, not through biological change that takes generations, but through the simple act of wrapping something around ourselves. We can pretend, in a sense that goes far beyond animal pretense. We can be someone other than the biological fact of our existence. The person standing on that ridge in November Europe. shivering in their animal skin clothing, isn't just solving a temperature problem. They're participating in something that would eventually allow humans to become anything lawyers and priests and artists and soldiers and emperors. All of it starts with the recognition that the body beneath the clothes is negotiable. That identity is something you can put on and take off. When you look at the evidence for early clothing, this is what you're really seeing. Not just the birth of practical gear, not just the solution to a climate problem, though it was that too. You're seeing the moment when humans became self-conscious, the moment when we started curating ourselves for an audience that includes ourselves, the moment when we looked in the water at our reflection and started wondering, what if I could be different?